Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this morning for our webinar in relation to race, faith and mental health in the workplace. I'm Leena Sovjani, a partner in the Medical Negligence Department at our London office, and I'm also the co-chair of my firm's Race Diversity Network, I Am Respect. I will be co-hosting this morning's webinar with my colleague Gurpreet Lally, who's an associate solicitor in the medical negligence team at our Cambridge office. On behalf of Gurpreet and I, a very warm welcome to you all this morning. So today we'll be talking about the intersectionality of mental health and race, and how we can have a better understanding of the mental health issues and challenges that our colleagues from ethnic minority communities may face, and importantly, what action we can take as colleagues and employers to be more inclusive and supportive. So on that note, I am delighted to welcome our esteemed panel of speakers this morning. We are joined by Jaina Chudasama from Business in the Community, Professor John Morgan, Consultant Psychiatrist, Jasveer Singh OBE, Family Law Barrister and Chair of the City Seats Network, and finally our very own Rebecca Horton, who is a trainee costs lawyer based in our Sheffield office. A warm welcome to all of our speakers this morning. Before we get started, just a few practical points for our listeners. Firstly, this webinar is being recorded, and so it will be available for later viewing and sharing on our website and YouTube channel. And secondly, many of you have submitted questions in advance of today's webinar, so thank you for that. But just to flag, you will all have seen that there's a Q&A box located to the right of your screen, so please do submit further questions as you hear from our speakers. Then once we've heard from them all, Gurpreet and I will be holding a Q&A session at the very end. So on that note, I will hand over to Gurpreet to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Leena. So our first speaker is Jaina Chudasama, who is a Diversity and Inclusion Advisor at Business in the Community. Jaina works with organisations in both the public, private and non-profit sectors on their diversity and inclusion agenda. She specialises in diversity and inclusion maturity assessments, strategy development and execution, and customised training development and delivery with a specific focus on race, age and gender. Race and ethnicity is a key area of passion, and she hopes to get more organisations feeling comfortable having conversations around the topic and developing strategic actions. Jaina, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much, Gurpreet, and good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you all about race and mental health. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please, Olivia. So as you can see, we, in our wellbeing campaign at Business in the Community, we have 4 pillars of health and wellbeing, with them being physical, mental, social and financial. Today, I will be focusing specifically on the mental aspect. And as you can see from my slide, there's some really stark statistics about some of the differences that ethnic minorities face in the UK compared to some equivalent white people. So we can see that some ethnic minority groups report more mental ill health than the white group. We also have, if you think about kind of the current situation with COVID-19 and how we have seen a disproportionate effect on ethnic minority communities. Actually, if you think about people going out, just leaving their house, how that can build up anxiety and how that can also have a disproportionate effect on ethnic minority communities. Olivia, if we can just move on to the next slide, please. So on our wellbeing campaign at Business in the Community, we produced, every year we produce a report based off the back of our mental health at work survey. And so we have been doing this since 2017, and the results on my screen are from our most recent one in 2019. And we have lots and lots of verbatim comments from people across the UK in both the public and private sector about their experiences at work. And what we found, as you can see from my slide, is overall almost 2 in 5, so 39% of employees have experienced poor mental health where work was a contributing factor in the past year, and that is actually up from the findings in 2018, which was 36%. However, for ethnic minority employees, it was actually 1 in 2, so 47% of ethnic minority employees in 2019 have experienced poor mental health where work was a contributing factor. We also have found that 51% of employees overall feel comfortable talking generally in their workplace about mental health issues. So there still is definitely a stigma around it, but actually only 40% of ethnic minority employees feel comfortable. And this can be linked to a further finding from the research that white employees are more likely than those from an ethnic minority background to have been formally diagnosed with a mental health condition. And the findings for that were 31% of ethnic minority employees compared to 23% of white employees. And we have also found that of those ethnic minority employees who have experienced mental health symptoms related to work, a quarter of these stated their ethnicity was a factor in these symptoms, compared to only 1% of those with work-related symptoms who identified as being white. So you can see there's definitely across the spectrum kind of some issues across both the ethnic minority employees and across white employees, but actually really drilling down into that data, hopefully you can see some of those disparities that have been coming out of our survey findings across the UK. And one of the kind of key things that we have seen that really ties into the discussion around mental health and race and ethnicity, so Olivia, if you could move on to my next slide, please, thank you, is something called racial trauma and race-based traumatic stress. So there's lots of different terms used for this, but I think this is a key kind of factor that really can cause some of those disparities. So there's systemic health and economic inequalities that can sometimes have an impact on how someone feels in terms of their mental well-being. And you can see kind of from this slide some of the quotes that some psychologists have attributed to race-based traumatic stress, but a helpful way of explaining the impact of race and well-being is through this framework where there's 4 pillars. So there's the personal daily experiences of overt racism, bullying and harassment, and something called micro behaviours. So these are really subtle everyday activities that can be micro acts but with a macro impact. You also have vicarious exposure, so kind of when people, family and friends around you have experienced racism, that's that kind of vicarious trauma to that specific individual. Then there's something called intergenerational trauma, which you may have heard of. So that's trauma that has passed down through the generations, and actually kind of it has been found that this trauma can be experienced by a mother, can be passed down genetically to their children. So there's a kind of clear link there between the mental well-being of the mother to the child. There's also something called historical trauma. So a term you may have heard is called collective trauma. And this is where a shared experience has shaped how people feel. So it could be a historical event such as colonialism, the Holocaust, the slavery, and the slavery trade. And actually that could have an impact on how people feel, but also kind of they may not even know they're experiencing bad signs of well-being. So there's definitely lots of things at play, especially with the current climate. So like I said, COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter movement, so the death of George Floyd would definitely be kind of classed as something that may have caused vicarious trauma, also historical trauma, but also playing on intergenerational trauma as well. So how people feel because of what someone else has experienced. And actually that was a great time for organisations just to pause and ask Black employees across their workforces how they were doing and how they were feeling. But kind of what can we do as individuals and what can we do as organisations? So Olivia, if you don't mind moving on to my next slide, please. Thank you. So I think one of the key things is actually to understand racism and its impact, and it's a really, really kind of broad term that I'm saying there, and it takes a lot of kind of work, and it's not something we can do overnight, but it's that kind of commitment to being anti-racist and that commitment to learning. So thinking about how you can be an ally, thinking about how you can listen to your colleagues and actually support them. So if you notice signs of bad well-being, what can you do? If you can move on to my next slide, please, Olivia. Thank you. So, and then also thinking about as an organisation, how does this organisation become an anti-racist workplace? So thinking about kind of the support that your organisation offers, is there kind of people who are specifically dealt with to deal with some of these issues? So would they be able to have a confident conversation about race, for example, or is that something that people are still shying away from? And if you could move on to my last slide, please, Olivia. Thank you. And last but not least, as kind of supporting ethnic minorities as individuals, just trying to check in with people, having a non-judgmental attitude and listening, knowing what support is available and being able to signpost that as well. I'm happy to take more specific questions at the end, but I hope that has shed some insight, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Jane, and it's really helpful, and it was really interesting to see all the stark comparison between ethnic minorities and their white colleagues, and if they're willing to share their issues of mental health with their employers. Thank you for joining us this morning. Lena, sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you, Gurpreet, and thank you, Jaina. Our next speaker is Rebecca Horton, who is a trainee costs lawyer based in Irwin Mitchell Sheffield office. Rebecca has been with our firm for 4 years, and as well as working as a trainee costs lawyer, she leads our race diversity group in Sheffield. In addition to that, she's also one of our Healthy Minds advocates. And this means that she's been trained as a mental health champion by Mental Health First Aid England. Rebecca is going to be speaking to us this morning about her own experiences with mental health and race. Rebecca, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that, Lena. Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca. So yeah, I've been working at Irwin Mitchell for 4 years, as Lena's mentioned. The things I'm going to be talking about are going to be my own brief history on mental health and taboos within the Black community, and also a little bit about mental health and racism just within the workplace. So just going on my own experience with mental health. So growing up, I am from the north, Sheffield in particular, so it was very, not many Black people especially in the area that I grew up in. So I was bullied just for, you know, the colour of my skin, just for looking different when growing up in a predominantly white area. This did have an effect on me growing up, and it did actually have more of an effect on me than I actually thought it did. And this ended up, you know, leading me to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression back in 2018. Now, with that, I did seek help. I got that help through speaking to my own family members. They were super supportive of the way that I went about things. They were super supportive. They were there to help. Counselling as well, so counselling or any form of therapy. I personally went through the counselling route. I also went on medication, which, you know, there is a bit of a taboo with that as well, and also just through exercise as well, so, you know, getting the endorphins going and taking my mind off things, and also journaling as well does help. So that's just my own experience. There are other people that do have different experiences with how they got help as well, but I can only really speak for myself on that one. So moving on to taboos within the Black community. Just got a few statistics that I've taken from mentalhealth.org.uk, and it says here that Black men were more likely to experience a psychotic disorder than their white counterparts. the risk of psychosis within the Black Caribbean community is nearly 7 times higher than that of the white population. And the detention rates under the Mental Health Act were 4 times higher among Black people during 2017 and 2018, where, you know, if we're looking at those statistics, there's clearly a bit of an issue, not just within the Black community when it comes to speaking about mental health, but also outside of it as well. There must be, it does seem that there is a kind of an assumption to kind of put the kind of crazy word on Black people when it does come to mental health. So in order to break, just going on to some of the actual taboos within the Black community. So there is colorism and mental health. So darker skinned people within the Black community, they are seen to be portrayed as more aggressive and angry and intimidating. Trust me, we're not. And even if we are angry, there's nothing wrong with us actually, you know, feeling those emotions, because we are human too. Then there is also religion. For myself, I grew up in a Christian household. There was a stigma that was having a mental health disorder or feeling depressed. That was something that was kind of demonic, and it wasn't good for the spirit. And, you know, like I've said, these are just human emotions, these are human feelings. And to kind of pin it on something like, you know, a demon, or saying that you shouldn't be depressed because you have a faith, that makes it seem like you shouldn't be able to talk about those things, even if these things are bothering you. Then there's also anti-Blackness within other communities as well, which may tie into mental health and well-being. I grew up thinking that people of colour, Black and brown people, should be sticking together. And I did experience racism or anti-Blackness from another ethnic minority group. So that for me, I thought, well, is it just, you know, how can I, there was just basically a sense of confusion and slight anxiety of being judged by other people that I approached who were of a darker hue in their skin tone. And these can make Black people feel quite isolated from their peers and from their allies as well. And it can prevent Black people from speaking about their mental health. However, the conversation is opening up amongst Black people within the community, and we should be able to normalise talking about how we're feeling, how we're doing. If we're doing good, if we're doing bad, we should be able to speak about those things without any form of judgment. So just moving on to mental health and racism in the workplace. Obviously, there's explicit racism, which people have experienced in the workplace, but there's also microaggressions as well. Now, back in June, I did write an open letter, and part of it was to do with microaggressions within the workplace. I did mention about Black women's hair, for example, going to an interview, for example, wearing a more Eurocentric style rather than our own natural hair, because we feel that might be something that will help us to actually get a job, and then probably being afraid to wear our hair in the workplace. There's also food that we probably brought from home. So say if there is food that is probably, you know, part of our culture, and other people are thinking, oh, what's that food there? What's that? That looks a bit, you know, X, Y, and Z. Those are microaggressions too. And instead of just kind of judging these sort of things, we should be asking, you know, that looks interesting. You know, could you educate me more on that, rather than just being like, oh, well, that looks a little bit, a bit like that. So these are just the things that we do need to have a look at within the workplace as well. And these experiences can also make Black people feel a bit undervalued, not really more of an employee, but more of a spectacle within the workplace. So how can we tackle this? Ways that we can tackle it are by having honest and open conversations with our peers and with our allies about race. allowing Black people to have a voice and to listen to what they have to say about these experiences. This encourages to break the stigma within the Black community, and it will also encourage allies to be able to see that, you know, basically just to kind of eradicate the way that they probably felt about us in the first place. At Irwin Mitchell, we do have a wellbeing hub. As Lena mentioned, I am one of many Healthy Mind advocates that are helping those who are struggling with mental health, and also signposting to resources that are available. Especially this year, since we've been working from home, we are available. We are just one click away. If you do want to speak to us about anything that is bothering yourselves, then we are here for that. And also in general for people who are outside of the organisation, just encourage people to talk, always lend an ear, see how they are, see how they're doing. You never know, they might actually open up to you. But if it is something that you probably aren't able to, you know, help yourself, you can always signpost them to other organisations as well. So there's like Mind.org, Black Minds Matter, that's if they so wish. But yeah, I think that what we should take away from this is just being able to listen and helping others. And when it does come to Black people, encourage them to talk so that we can actually help break the stigma within our community. So thank you.
Rebecca, thank you so much. You've spoken to us very candidly about some really personal matters in terms of what you've experienced yourself in terms of depression and anxiety. And I sincerely thank you for that, because as you've said, one of the main challenges in ethnic minority communities is breaking that stigma around mental health. And we can only do that if individuals come forward and are willing to talk openly about their experiences. So thank you once again.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Professor John Morgan. Professor Morgan is a general adult psychiatrist and a senior academic who has also run the Royal College of Psychiatrists Patient Safety Group, and he also advises on government policy pertaining to suicide prevention, including issues of culture and ethnicity. Professor Morgan is also a medico-legal expert and is widely instructed across a number of the teams at Irwin Mitchell. He has an interest in cultural barriers to accessing evidence-based mental health support, including barriers experienced by ethnic minorities accessing psychotherapy as opposed to pharmacotherapy, as well as researching how self-harm and eating disorders manifest in different cultural groups. So thank you for joining us this morning, Professor Morgan.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to reinforce some of what's already been said. And when I prepared my talk, it was focused on the many challenges that ethnic minorities face. But it did strike me that I might begin also with some of the positives in terms of race and faith. In the last few days, I've been involved clinically in a patient who was very reluctant to attend a day centre that would have helped her very much. And instead, I encouraged her involvement in her Gurdwara, and she found that a very positive, inclusive experience. I also, again, without breaching confidentiality, assessed someone using video, which is quite interesting when you look at people's backdrops. And she was sat there in front, very proudly in front of portraits of Nelson Mandela and Malcolm X. And we had a really interesting chat about Malcolm X and how inspiring she'd found his personal philosophy. So I think there's a danger in just emphasizing the negatives, that we also need to look at the strengths and the positives that can be drawn out of people's cultural and sometimes their spiritual background. Now, psychiatry is very secular, so we can be loath to discuss or touch on these issues. My own academic publications in the field really began in a series of papers on Christianity and eating disorders, in which patients with anorexia nervosa were talking of their condition in religious terms and citing biblical justifications for self-starvation. And we couldn't really challenge those justifications easily necessarily in a secular medical setting, but we brought in a very eminent chaplain who was a psychotherapist who became part of our clinical team, who ultimately was able to explore patients' religious beliefs as a way of formulating and challenging some of their psychopathology. So, I mean, my take-home message is really how important people's cultural backgrounds are in the recovery process, and how there are resources out there that can really be drawn on to help. But I would reinforce, however, what's already been said, that people from BA/ME backgrounds are at higher risk of mental disorder, and the academic literature suggests that that links directly with the racism, the trauma that we were hearing of earlier, discrimination, and then the broader social disadvantages. And yet we know that patients from BA/ME backgrounds are less likely to be able to access treatment, and they're more likely to receive a sort of treatment that's custodial. Again, we've heard already about the use of the Mental Health Act. There's an overuse of medication and an underuse of psychotherapy. So you're much more likely to be prescribed pills, though there is a role for medication, and less likely to be referred for psychotherapy. You know, to be blunt, young black men rarely get on the waiting lists for psychotherapy. As a junior doctor working in Tooting, I well remember assessing patients brought in on Section 136, and they would explicitly tell me that they were commonly detained by the police and brought in to the local sort of asylum as a way of dealing with sort of lippy young black men. So I think sort of institutions can abuse the powers and the rights for quite explicitly racist reasons. There are particular barriers to accessing treatment for people from certain ethnic minorities. My own interest is in accessing treatment for eating disorders, and we know that second generation Asian schoolgirls are at probably the highest risk of developing anorexia or bulimia of any group in the UK, yet they're far less likely to go to their GPs. Then if they do go to their GPs, they're far less likely to be referred for treatment. And in part, that's because of a perception that sort of anorexia is a white person's disease. In part, it's because of a stigma within the community to admit that you have a disorder that can be held against you. And so we're trying to break down those barriers to referral, because it has to be said, in my own service, we have very, very few people from that background in treatment, despite knowing that it is the greatest risk. For other people of ethnic minority, they're not going to go to their GP and say, "I'm depressed, please help me." I think some, perhaps more men than other groups, are going to present to their GP with abdominal pain or chest pain, and they may go through a process of physical investigations for tummy pains or chest pains, rather than admit that they're desperately unhappy and would like to talk about their feelings. In a nutshell, if you find it hard to put your feelings into words, those feelings express themselves through your body. And if you feel sort of confined within a particular societal role, perhaps as the provider for your family, it's hard to then say, look, I'm desperately sad and melancholic, and more likely that you'll present to your GP with maybe chest pain, and you have cardiac investigations for that. So it's important, I think, for employers to consider when their employees are presenting not only overtly with mental illness, but also when they're perhaps presenting more covertly with physical symptoms and signs. I chair a suicide prevention group nationally, and we know that there are particularly high risks of suicide amongst BA/ME people. We know, for example, South Asian women, older South Asian women are at a particularly high risk of suicide, yet very rarely ask for help or treatment. Then, when admitted to hospital for treatment, sometimes services aren't very good at facilitating support for faith-based needs. Again, I've encountered people who simply want access to a decent halal diet, and yet their choice on the menu is the same bloody thing day in, day out. At the moment, I have an issue trying to access appropriate kosher food for someone. Accessing chaplains can be really helpful, and I think having a decent chaplaincy is all important, crossing all faiths. And yet chaplaincies have been cut financially, because when you're looking to cut budgets, I think it seems the sort of the softer option to get rid of some of the chaplains or to reduce the multi-faith access. So in conclusion, people from BAME backgrounds are at much higher risks of mental disorder. They're more likely to be detained for those disorders, to be over-medicated and under therapized. There are barriers to treatment that come both from within and from without. And yet again, to emphasize the positives, I think for people to be aware of the strengths that derive from race and faith can be an important way forwards. And of course, I'm saying all of this with hideous awareness that I'm particularly male, pale, and probably a little bit stale. So thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you, Professor Morgan. That was really helpful, and especially highlighting that actually race and faith can have a positive impact on mental health as well. So thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Gurpreet. Thank you, Professor Morgan. So our final speaker this morning is Jasveer Singh, OBE. Jasveer is a prolific campaigner and activist. He's a practicing family law barrister based in Middle Temple and a regular contributor to BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day. He's a trustee and patron of several regional and national charities within the faith and minorities sector, including the City Sikhs Network and the Faith Forum for London. He's also co-founder of South Asian Heritage Month, an annual awareness month which celebrates South Asian arts, culture, history and identity. He was awarded an OBE in 2017 for his extensive community work. Jasveer, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Lena. First of all, I want to thank Owen Mitchell for putting this together, because I think it's important for us to be able to have these sorts of spaces where we can talk about mental health, but talk about also the intersectional aspects of mental health and mental health awareness. One of the many projects that I'm involved in is called the British Sikh Report, and that's an annual report that's produced looking at the wishes, feelings and views of the Sikh community at large. We've been running since 2013, and in 2018 we looked at mental health. We wanted to look at what were the concerns within the Sikh community about mental health, the provision and the support that's out there, but also we wanted to discuss what are the causes of stress, what are the issues which actually impact upon the Sikh community at large. And in the British Sikh Report 2018, we found that 75% of British Sikhs saw the workplace as being a cause of stress. 35% said that it was a major cause of stress in their lives, and 39% said that it was a minor cause. But 3 out of 4 Sikhs see that as being a major or minor cause of stress in their lives. And I think it's important to bear that in mind, because as individuals, we spend so much time in the workplace with our colleagues. Obviously, for the last 6-7 months, we haven't been able to spend that time with our colleagues, but we have still been working, many of us, and being in that work environment can be quite trying and challenging at times. Now, in the work that we did with the British Sikh Report, we did a deeper delve just to find out what were the reasons for other forms of stress within the community, and what were the challenges that exist there. We found that, for example, with Sikh men, that there was a real issue with concepts of toxic masculinity, the need to be seen as alpha males in the workplace or at home, the need to be confident, the need to always portray themselves as being in control of situations, and also the fear of revealing their own emotions, talking about their own feelings, because they thought that would be seen as a sign of weakness. So you have that on one side, and then on the other side, there were the cultural expectations that women had. And much of what I'm saying here, although it applies to the Sikh community, I would argue applies to South Asian communities generally, and also to other minority ethnic communities. So with the cultural expectations for women within families, we found that many of them felt that they had to balance having a family on one side and a career on the other. The push and pull of having a successful professional commitments and career, but juggling that with responsibilities at home, such as caring for children, for older family members, cooking and cleaning, for example, minor things that many of us would think are inconsequential, and perhaps many of us will be surprised by the fact that there are still these strong gender-based divisions within family environments, but they do exist. There is also then the high expectations that exist within families and communities when it comes to education and the workplace. And if you have any friends or colleagues who are Asian, one of the things, and I speak anecdotally now, that you can often see is that there is this real sense of one-upmanship, almost keeping up with the Joneses, wanting to say, well, I've got a brand new car, or this is my home, or I'm moving into a bigger house than we had before. And there's this real sense of drive for ambition, which is good. It's strong. It seems to come from a place of confidence. But then we also need to think about the flip side, those who aren't in that position, those who feel that they're being left behind, and those who feel that they are failures, unfortunately, because of those high expectations that exist. And to compound all of that, over the last 10, 12 years, we've seen the rise of social media and the impact that that has had. So we look at things such as Facebook, for example, we look at Instagram in particular, and we see that people are encouraged to share photographs of themselves when they're happy, when they're in times of joy, when they're succeeding, but no one really talks about their own emotions or difficulties or challenging times in those public environments to the extent that they do when they're talking about happy times. And I think that then leads to a skewed idea of what it means to be someone who is living in the 21st century, but who's also perhaps from an ethnic minority and also coming from faith communities where these sorts of issues are often not spoken about. So all of that compounds to create an environment which can be quite toxic, unfortunately. When we have a look at cultural identity and how that's addressed within the professional environment, it's wonderful to hear from Professor John Morgan and for him to talk so openly about how there is a sense of cultural awareness that exists. Certainly, when the research was being done for the British Sikh Report in 2018, one thing that came across time and time again was the lack of any cultural awareness in vast swathes of therapies and treatments. The focus primarily on medication rather than trying to look at other ways in which things could be treated, such as talking therapies. But even then, when it comes to talking therapies, the lack of specific or culturally appropriate services that are available. And that has been a real issue, which has led to, certainly in the last few years or so, again, the rise of smaller community-based projects which are looking to change the way that things are being spoken of. Now, we've already heard Rebecca talking about some of the work that's being done within the Black community. Talking about the Punjabi community, there is an organisation called Taraqi, which was created about 3 years ago, which is trying to challenge the toxic masculinity and provide an environment for Punjabi men across the country to be able to talk openly about their own mental health and well-being. And I think part of the reason why it's taken so long for these sorts of projects to emerge is because of the concept of shame, which is a heavy concept which exists within many minority communities. And also this idealism, the idea that we need to maintain our family reputation or our personal reputations in the community generally. We also need to think about the intersectional identities that employees may have. Race and faith is an important identity, but there may be others which impact upon employees. For example, they may be LGBTQ+, and not speaking about that openly. They may have disabilities which are not visible. They may have other things which are impacting upon their lives. And sometimes it can be a case of, for example, being a South Asian man, being a Muslim, being LGBT, being having a disability or an increasing disability over a period of time. All of that then again just builds up and up and up to have a detrimental impact, unfortunately. Now, I'm a family law barrister and I've been practicing for the last 14 years. And one of the things that I've seen over the years, which is perhaps the most traumatic of experiences that people can undergo, is a breakdown of a long-term relationship or marriage. That has a supreme impact on an individual's well-being. And it may well be that there are many people who don't talk about this openly in the workplace or with their friends, because again, they see that as a failure. They see that as something to be ashamed of. And unfortunately, and again, I'm going by anecdotal evidence, but also with the work that I've done over the years, my own casework, I've seen that those who are from minority ethnic backgrounds are more likely to be in a position to hide or wanting to hide certain aspects of the breakdown of a marriage or other issues which have arisen than others. And it's again this concept of shame. I think we also need to take into account the fact that people who are from minority ethnic backgrounds are less likely than their white British counterparts to access mental health support from GPs. And because they're less likely to do that, they're more likely to end up in the crisis care instead. So anything that can be done to assist people at the earlier stages is obviously to be supported and to be promoted. It was interesting also hearing Jana talking about collective trauma. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of collective trauma which have had an impact on people of faith communities and minority backgrounds. So the first that comes to mind was last February, March time, and that was a Christchurch mosque attack and the massacre. And the number of people who I met who were from Muslim backgrounds who were deeply traumatized by that, and not just Muslim backgrounds, other faith backgrounds as well. That trauma stayed with them for several months. And in fact, I was speaking to a friend of mine just 3 or 4 days ago, and she broke down because she was thinking back to what had happened at that time, thinking about her own family situation. I think she was going off to a university that she was seeing with her son, you know, just looking at that before applying. And she broke down. She said that it was so awful that she just thought, what would have happened if it was her own family members involved in that? And sometimes international events can have an impact on the well-being, the mental well-being of employees, of colleagues, of friends. Another thing which has impacted the Black communities in particular and other non-white communities is the death of George Floyd. And that death has resulted in the Black Lives Matter movement really gaining profile and becoming a major international player when it comes to changing society for the better. But that also comes from a place of trauma. And we shouldn't minimize the trauma that is felt by people as a result of international events. Now, what can we do to improve things? How can we change things? I think one of the things that, again, coming back to what Professor John Morgan said, was we should see faith as a positive. I know that when I felt stressed by situations which are beyond my immediate control, I've turned to my own faith, and I've turned to meditative practices that some may describe as being prayer, which I would perhaps describe more as being spiritual mindfulness. And it's a great way of almost regaining my stability, you know, getting an equilibrium again. It's very helpful for myself, and I've seen just how important it's been for others, particularly during COVID-19 and the lockdown. One of the issues that we saw was places of worship which were closed. The fact that they were closed was having a profound impact on many people from faith communities. And as soon as they reopened, there were people who were saying, I felt a great sense of relief being able to go back into my place of worship somewhere I've been denied entry or denied an opportunity to spend time at for a significant period of time. So we should see faith as a positive and promote that for those who are people of faith, and those who aren't people of faith, respect and accept their beliefs, respect their beliefs, and support them in what they feel is perhaps the way that works best for them. We need to be able to challenge cultural misconceptions, and within the South Asian community, those include things such as black magic or the evil eye, blaming external factors for someone's poor mental health rather than trying to address the issues which have caused the mental health issues to arise in the first place. We need to be able to have frank and open discussions in a non-judgmental manner. And more importantly, we need to be able to encourage people to talk about their mental health more openly and to allow that to be normalised within the workplace. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights and observations. I was really interested to hear about the findings of the British Sikh report. I appreciate, obviously, that was focusing on the Sikh community in the UK, but everything you mentioned in relation to the cultural expectation really resonates with me personally, and I'm from the Hindu community. And in fact, at Irwin Mitchell, we had a recent roundtable where we were looking at the intersectionality between race and gender. And the points you made, which came out from your report in relation to the, there's still very much being strong gender-based divisions, came out very much in that discussion, and the push-pull you talked about as well in relation to balancing career and family. Thank you so much, Jasveer. So thank you to all our speakers. We now have time for some questions. And some questions were submitted in advance, which I will work my way through. And I've also got a couple of questions here myself. I think the first question, if I could put this to Professor Morgan, both you and Jasveer have mentioned that people from ethnic minority communities are less likely to obtain support from primary care services such as GP. And Professor Morgan, you said that there's an overuse of medication and people are less likely to be referred for psychotherapy. And Jasveer has commented that in some instances that this could mean that people end up in a crisis situation having not sought support. I just wondered to what extent, Professor Morgan, you think that language might be a barrier for some people when seeking psychotherapy support, and what's available to get around that?
Yes, I think language is a barrier, and also there can be an undue allowance for translation from relatives. Sometimes if you're going to your GP and you're upset and stressed, it's because your husband or wife are getting you down. And then if the GP uses your husband or wife to translate, that's not exactly a forum for open discussion. Sometimes finding the right translator is challenging. I've been in clinical situations where someone from Eritrea was given a translator who came from a very much an opposing tribe in Eritrea, and actually was quite traumatized by having that translator. I've been in situations where understanding of a particular Christian group in Goa was very challenging because of the way the beliefs were expressed, and actually the translator that we had really educated me as to how the interpretation of Christian beliefs was given in that setting. So I think a good translator is worth their weight in gold and can really help to educate. But I think language barriers are a problem. On the other hand, I think that can be a bit of a fig leaf, and sometimes it's just that doctors produce their own prejudices, and a depressed young black lad is given medication or described as being sort of difficult or angry. I mean, perhaps we could see how Meghan Markle's been portrayed as being, I think the horrible word was uppity, this sort of way of actually almost turning someone into other. And that helps the doctor feel more comfortable because they become an object rather than someone that they're really needing to listen to.
Thank you, Professor Morgan. Jasveer, is there anything that you would add to that?
No, nothing that comes to mind immediately. No, okay. I think it's Yes, I think there are issues which need to be addressed, but I think Professor Morgan's covered it well.
Sure, thank you. Okay, the next question that I have here, I think, is one for you, Rebecca, which is in order to become a Healthy Minds advocate or to take up a similar role in any organisation, do you consider it's necessary for someone to have experienced their own mental health challenges?
Not at all. Not at all. When I did the mental health first aid course, there were people there that actually hadn't experienced their own mental health. They hadn't experienced any problems or issues with their own mental health. It's more to do with spotting the signs. So even if you yourself haven't experienced that, if you are actually able to, you know, learn about how people deal with their mental health, other people, then that should be enough. So actually being empathetic, being able to listen to people, and being able to just signpost as well, that's actually pretty much enough to become a Healthy Mind advocate. So.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I guess that's key, isn't it? It's not, you're not expected to be a counsellor or a psychotherapist, because you're not, but as you say, identifying issues, being there as the sort of first port of call for people being able to approach you and then signposting them and ensuring that they're able to obtain the professional help that they seek. Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Just looking at the list of the questions that were submitted in advance, I think this question is probably one for Jasveer. To what extent, Jasveer, do employers need to be aware of the interplay between race and faith when supporting colleagues with mental health issues?
It's an important one, and this is where it's perhaps important for employees and managers to receive appropriate training so that they can tell that there are these issues which can often be seen almost contradictory. So I'll give you a quick example when it comes to the Sikh community and the Punjabi community. The Sikh community frowns upon alcohol use. Certain parts of the community, it's prohibited. And yet within Punjabi culture, there's a heavy reliance on a heavy kind of promotion of drinking. And there's a heavy issue of alcoholism within Northern Indian communities. And that in itself leads to poor mental health. So it can often be difficult when you're looking at, say, what is the religious issue here? What is the cultural issue? And it may well be that the religious issue in those circumstances would be a sense of shame, that one is an alcoholic when alcohol is frowned upon. And yet on the flip side, there's a hypermasculinity that comes with the Punjabi community and the focus there. So I think it is important to have that level of understanding on certainly some issues. There's no way that managers or employers would ever be able to find out every single nuance that exists within communities. But there are certain things which it's reasonably easy to find out about simply by doing research on the internet and looking at the various reports that exist out there. But I think it is important to know that the intersectional and the interplay between race and faith can sometimes seem contradictory.
Yeah. Thank you, Jasveer. Professor Morgan, another question for you, and then Gertrude, I'm going to hand over to you. You mentioned, Professor Morgan, that within ethnic minority communities, it's quite common for people to present with physiological symptoms as opposed to psychological symptoms, and that certainly that is something that employers should be looking out for when considering whether there might be underlying mental health issues. I mean, to what extent are GPs equipped to recognise that physiological complaints in some ethnic minority communities may have an underlying psychological cause?
I think a good GP would think of this, and a good GP is part of their community, so would understand the community It's not a new phenomenon. It's as old as the hills, you know, middle-aged blokes who are perhaps feeling that they're the head of a household, which sounds a bit sexist, I know, then find it hard to sort of say, look, I'm depressed. And so they're going to their GP, sort of holding their tummy, holding their chest, feeling breathless. And if asked the right direct questions, they'll be very happy to give the right direct answers. But there can be a bit of a charade that goes on where the patient is given, you know, an inhaler or a beta blocker, and they're sent on their way. Whereas just giving someone an opportunity to talk about their desperation can really help. And that's all part of the GP being part of the community. Now, when I'm where I work, I have a long corridor of many doctors of different cultural backgrounds, and if in doubt, I can just walk along the corridor and ask someone from a particular, you know, cultural background. There's no lacking of diversity, and I think therefore perhaps talking to colleagues at an informal level is really helpful. Brilliant.
Thanks, Professor Morgan. Gurpreet, I'll hand over to you. I think we've got time for a couple of more questions before we round up.
Thanks, Lena. I've got a couple of questions. I think it's probably best this one's for Jana. So what would you say for an employee from an ethnic minority background, what would prevent them from going to their employer about any mental health issues?
Thanks, Gurpreet. So I think one of the big things is kind of that comfort level and feeling safe in their organisation. I think for me, that's probably the biggest reason, and that can be for a number of reasons. I think sometimes having conversations around race and ethnicity is challenging in itself, and then if you have to then talk about your own mental health issues at the same time, it can feel like actually this is too overwhelming, and it may be something that is just too difficult for people to do. So I think it's kind of about creating that safe space where people feel that they can trust their organisations and that it won't hinder their progression opportunities, for example. It won't kind of hinder the way people see them as well. Sometimes it can be about the perception of how line managers might see them. So I think it's about supporting line managers to be able to have these conversations and actually point out some of the signs where they can be proactive as well.
Yeah. Thank you. And just sort of one final question, for all of our panelists, is what would be your top 2 or 3 tips that you would give employers and supporting colleagues that are from an ethnic minority background and with their mental health? So if we start with Professor Morgan.
I think just listening and learning.
Oh, perfect. Jana?
I would definitely agree with listening and being able to have a really kind of constructive two-way dialogue. Also, as individuals, kind of educating ourselves about some racism people may experience and its emotional, mental and physical impacts as well. And thinking about kind of mental health advocates in the workplace, do they come from a diverse background so people can kind of go to people that they can assimilate with?
Brilliant. Rebecca?
One thing that I would say, I mean, kind of going off the back of listening and learning to what people have to say is, even if, you know, one thing that I would say is to be honest to that person as well. So say, for example, they have come to you with a problem. If you aren't able to, you know, you're not there to solve that issue if you aren't in a position to actually do that. So if you're not a qualified counsellor, if you're not a qualified psychologist, it's okay. Obviously, don't give advice, but point them in the right direction to be able to get them to go and get help. So that would probably be a tip.
Thank you. And Jasmine?
I would say that listening, obviously, as everyone else has said, I think it's important, as I said earlier, to encourage people to talk about their mental health more openly. The more it's normalised in the workplace, the less it becomes an issue to be ashamed about, and the more it fosters a sense of non-judgmental discussions to take place and open discussions. And then finally, I would say having appropriate levels of training, making sure that those who are in leadership, those who are in management roles, can better understand some of the cultural issues that people in the workplace may be experiencing, and also better understand the faith identities. The more that that's done, the more that hopefully these sorts of issues can be picked up earlier.
Brilliant, thank you. So I just want to say a thank you to everyone for joining us this morning, and a special thank you to all of our guest speakers, Jaina Chilasima, Rebecca Horton, Professor Morgan and Jasvir. It's been really insightful discussion about how we can support employees from different ethnic minority backgrounds and recognise when they may need some additional support. On behalf of me and Lena, thank you to all of our listeners who have joined us this morning, and those of you who will be watching this webinar later on. A copy of the webinar will be emailed around to everyone who has joined us, along with some useful tips which you might find useful. On the screen, you should see a whole host of series of webinars which are taking place this week. So if you'd like to join any of those, please do feel free to sign up. You'll also be emailed a feedback survey, which will take 2 minutes, and we'll be really grateful for any of your feedback and any future webinars that you'd like to see from us. Thank you, and we wish you a wonderful day.